A warm welcome also from me. Thanks for the warm welcome from Richard. And I want to start with a beginning of a story. 14 years ago, one night, out of a sudden, I experienced a shift in my life. It hit me out of the blue. I didn't know what was happening. It felt mostly joyful and a little bit scary. Joyful especially afterwards, but in the beginning it was a bit scary. And it made me ask some deep questions about life. Who am I? What am I about to do? What is really meaningful? What really serves not only me, but also us and even the entire world that we live in. Just a show of hands, have any one of you ever asked yourself such questions?
Yes.
That sounds good. Yes. So, fast forward 7 years. 7 years ago, one night, my life again changed all out of a sudden. I didn't know what was coming, and this time I was scared to death. In fact, I was scared that I was dying. I did not. There was a little bit of joy in it as well, although the fear was much stronger. And again, it made me ask these questions. Who am I? What am I? What am I going to do? What is really meaningful in life? And both times, some changes then occurred in my life. And these changes will be in some way meaningful to what I want to share with you today, also discuss with you. I aim to make it interactive with you. I'm not sure whether I will succeed. I also have the challenge that, as usual, I put tons of slides, and I basically want to connect everything, so it's going to be very challenging. But the topic, anyways, is about collaboration. And it's about the joy of collaboration, also the necessity of collaboration, especially in our time and age, and the difficulty of collaboration. So there will be a shared journey of not only inspiration, but also heartbreak, and also the question of how are we going to do this. And I will start, for the most part, with the joyful aspects and then go to the kind of new territory. I could, of course, say, if you look at the title, the subtitle, A Vision for a Mindful Academic Culture, make it very easy. Talk would be over in a minute if I were just to say, let's just bring mindfulness into academia and everything is going to be better. Some people might agree with that, others not, or maybe there would be a more nuanced way to look at this. But that's too simple. And I want to share with you why I think that is too simple and what it might take, and then I hope we can explore this together. And yes, to connect things to connect everything, it's useful to look at things from many different angles and perspectives. All our angles and perspectives of all of us here in the room, some of these could be the scientific angle and general academic angle, humanistic, a contemplative angle. I will say a little bit about what that means, or maybe also who in the room has some understanding of what contemplative could refer to, or contemplative traditions or practices. I see somebody nodding. Maybe hands up is easier for me to see. Okay, some hands are up. You could connect it to the word mindful on the slide before. It's more general, but mindfulness practices have something to do with contemplative practices and contemplative traditions, so there's a connection between these terms. But there's also something about a way of looking at things that can be understood by contemplative. Vita contemplativa is one Latin term that was used in the past to say there's a vita activa and a vita contemplativa. The one is the active engagement in the business of life, and the other is kind of to take a step back, to ponder more deeply the meaning of things, the meaning of life, etc. Also in spiritual or religious ways, oftentimes. Creative and artistic angles, etc. And to frame the whole, because of course we could go in all kinds of directions, but to frame the entire thing, I want to show this image that I took from a street market last Friday. This was a vegan food street market. You see various pictures, so close your eyes. No more looking. Did you see the ice bear? Who saw the ice bear? You're still looking? Okay, so here's the ice bear. Did you see Pope Francis here endorsing vegan lifestyles? This is all by an artist called Judith Frewein. Okay, so here is one other. And I really want to highlight actually this here to bring it out a little bit more. And I wonder what emotional response this picture evokes in you. Maybe just throw some words out. Anything that comes to your mind, like.
Not being yourself.
You said not being yourself. Yeah. Hopelessness.
It's a version of the three monkeys?
Yes, exactly. The original is, I think, called the three wise monkeys from Eastern, somewhere in the eastern part of the world. It has a different connotation than for us. There is this, not so turning a blind eye, but there is also, as you said, some kind of hopelessness. For me, it's a very unsettling picture. It's almost like there's some kind of imprisonment, a difficulty to speak up, a difficulty to look, a difficulty to listen. Maybe even trying to cover ourselves. And why do I bring this up? I want to invite us to take a perspective of where we are globally. Because otherwise, these questions that I asked in the beginning would be quite meaningless. But these questions are, what is really meaningful in life? Why are we here? What is important for us to do? In the service of what am I doing, or are you doing what you're doing in life? And there's something called a climate crisis, climate change, environmental crisis, loss of biodiversity, a sixth mass extinction. There are various names for something that is deeply unsettling. And for me, also in the context of this street market, this picture evokes such a response. And it shows us also the difficulty to actually look at these questions squarely. Now, what does collaboration have to do with it? I would say everything, because in order to address such challenges, as well as all the smaller ones, we have to learn how to collaborate. So the question is that an easy thing or not? I suppose all of us have had experiences with collaboration with colleagues, in companies, maybe in communities, in school, with classmates, even in families or in relationships. And not always is it easy. Sometimes it's joyful and sometimes not. So basically the question, what's not to like, or what's not ideal in the world? Just some of these examples. I mentioned the ecological crisis that we're in, the suffering of humans and other sentient beings, and something that I would describe as being trapped in runaway competition. We're competing for scarce or apparently scarce resources, time, money, fame, recognition, maybe something else comes up, something that we're in competition for, maybe even love sometimes, affection, security. And it's often an either or, and so there's this competition that for a scarce resource, either you have it and the other person doesn't, or the other way around. This kind of mindset just breeds more competition and many of the problems that we have today, including even wars. So academics, or generally sciences and humanities, could help also. And lead by example, because science altogether is fundamentally about collaboration, about trying to find out together and building up on what other people have discovered or the opinions of others. But it's not so easy. Let's look at the first part. We tend to talk about the ecological crisis, yet we avoid taking the necessary steps. And I should say I avoid taking the necessary steps. One person in our audience leads by example by not flying to academic conferences, for instance. I still fly to academic conferences. I contribute to our ecological crisis still. So, individually and collectively, we avoid taking necessary steps to address that. It's easier to talk about it, but sometimes even easier not to talk about it. It's easier not to talk about everything related to suffering. We don't want to hear it, we don't want to address it. It's not easy to share this, it's not easy to let ourselves be touched by it. How do we deal with it? Do we have capacities such as compassion? Do we know how to grieve alone and together? And from that know what kind of wise action to take, including any kind of scientific research or any other kind of activity. And while both humanities and sciences and all of life and all of our human culture and even nature depend fundamentally on collaboration, we still find ourselves trapped in all kinds of runaway competition. So looking at academia, what aspects of academic overdrive competition might there be, and what could be harmful consequences of that? Who's engaged in academia in the room in some way? Is there, yes? Yes, okay, yeah. Chronic publication and career pressure, is that a thing? Would you agree? Yeah. It seems to be something about you have to publish or perish. A separation mindset, it's I have to compete versus others. A scarcity of key resources, especially funding, it's always scarce for pretty much everything in the world, it seems. Visibility, in man or woman power, this is not a very kind of gender-neutral term, expertise. What are harmful consequences? One that is maybe the most obvious, but is rarely talked about, is that people can just burn out. There's a joy through which we begin to do what we love to do, and that could be scientific or academic research or any kind of scholarship. And then being subjected to these pressures, at some point, we could just lose the joy in it. It kills the joy, we burn out. We might even skip what we had once loved. There might be reservations against sharing practices, open data, open science, and collaboration. We got something called publication metrics, and there is a tendency for all kinds of metrics. I think it's called the Goodhart's law, and what's the other? So there are two kinds of laws that describe or why people tend to optimize for metrics rather than act skillfully in the way that the metrics wanted to measure. Publication biases, that's a huge thing. Replicability issues, oftentimes statistically underpowered studies. In psychology, for instance, that's an enormous problem. And partly comes about from people having to compete in small teams against each other. If you've got a small team and scarce funding, you don't have the means to conduct a large study. And so you can run into all kinds of problems that could be mitigated and improved by more collaborative ways of working. A privatization of academic research as one response for the funding problem. But that has its own problems, including a kind of putting knowledge, putting research into boxes. Meanwhile, on a planet very, very nearby, some things are happening, as mentioned initially. So there's something about, temperatures continue to rise, biodiversity continues to be lost. Some problems are just becoming stronger and stronger. There's something about we cannot afford this any longer. So this is basically, this is a part that I want to bring across. I notice I have some difficulty to speak about it with full empathy because it would probably bring me to tears. And it sometimes does, and maybe that's a good thing when it happens. So, now what about all these aspects of collaboration? On one hand, collaboration is beautiful. We know that together we can be amazingly effective. For me personally, part of my history was being part of the research environment at CERN, doing particle physics research in a huge collaboration, and it was amazing for me to see not just what is technically possible, but that it is possible for so many people to work together. I will say a couple of things about collaboration at CERN that stood out to me that might help maybe inspire skillful practices for collaboration. There are many other research projects as well. And then, of course, we've got nature, or I actually intentionally put the term Mother Nature here. This seems to provoke some people in some areas and cultures. But it's literally true. Just the complexity of life, evolution over millions of years. Just think of one cell in your body, never mind an organ, never mind all the organs together, never mind the whole human being. In every moment, every second, is a huge miracle. And this comes about by all these bits and pieces collaborating together. So, collaboration is direly needed in all areas of humanity and life. I mentioned the ecological crisis. We've got many others, poverty, war, homelessness, etc., just in the human realm. Collaboration can be very difficult. Also, sometimes we collaborate maybe for the wrong or for destructive causes. Wars are an example of collaboration. One army collaborates against the other, and they destroy, whole countries and with millions upon millions of casualties and lots of tragedy. And so there's something about humility here, that it seems that collaboration is great, but there's also this nagging sense of we don't really know how to do this. So we need to start with humility. So brief history for how I got to this theme of collaboration. I was actually quite blessed to be at CERN doing physics research during my PhD time for several years. Here's a landscape picture of the area of Geneva with a sketch of how large this so-called Large Hadron Collider is underground. And on the left side, a picture of the ATLAS experiment, and was part of the ATLAS collaboration. You might see this little man here. So that just to show you the size of this is one instrument, just like one measurement device in order to measure what happens when particles collide. So it's huge. It's quite, well, absolutely mind-boggling, actually, at least for me. I think for pretty much everyone there. So CERN is a very collaborative undertaking, has been so from the beginning, has been brought to life a little bit after the Second World War, and has several member states. So here's just a map of all the member states and state associate members, mostly around Europe. And then there are also, if you look at this world map, many additional states with observer status or who just are part of this collaboration. It spans almost the entire globe. And it's more than 10,000, it's about, just adding these numbers here, more than 13,000 people working together on all these complex problems around particle physics. So, and then occurred this night 7 years ago. What was happening was I was working so hard at a time when I thought I needed to prove myself, prove myself that I'm in the right place. Something that I didn't really know how to talk with colleagues about. It felt like this is something I cannot tell my supervisor. So I was putting on this facade, meanwhile exhausting myself. Had a night when I completely broke down, had a panic attack, and thought I was going to die. I did not, as I said. Meanwhile, for many years, I'd also had a meditation practice. And so what happened after this was that I was looking at what else is meaningful in life, what else interests me. And so it happened that at some point I found out about a field called contemplative science, which was very intriguing for me. So contemplative science for me is a bit like this guy on the raft in the red shirt, looking very serene. And I'm one of the guys struggling on that other raft, trying to get over there. If you've ever tried to navigate on such a raft, I actually haven't done that. I imagine it to be very difficult. It's difficult for me to sit in a canoe, so balancing is pretty hard. Much less to get from one raft to the other. And I asked myself the question, okay, so here's a field that I find very compelling. I want to make a transition. I want to contribute to this other field, but I don't know how to. And one day during a meditation retreat, actually, suddenly I got inspired and thought, okay, so what am I most passionate about is this aspect of collaboration, and on the other hand, to do something that I find to be very meaningful, that was somewhere in this realm of contemplative science, mostly about the study of contemplative practices, including meditation practice, scientifically, and to see what kinds of effects and benefits that has for individuals as well as for society. So given all of the previously illustrated precarious ecological situation, the suffering, and knowing that collaboration is beautiful, needed, and difficult, the question for me arose, is a pretty long question. How can we basically work together to actualize something that is very transdisciplinary, that includes collaborative practices, contemplative practices, the best of scientific rigor, community building, and is, participatory, open, grounded in shared values, etc. And very importantly, beginning with ourselves first. And I think that might be the most challenging of this. And I continued to expand and explore this idea for a while. And to me, it seems that these 5 areas would be important. One of them I summarize as key factors and systemic principles. I'll start with that one and then work my way up. So let's start with this one. This is about transitions and recontextualizations of ways in which we're doing things, of ways we're usually working and doing science. And the question is, how can we actually make collaborative efforts in order to move from this scarcity-based competitive way of being to a more abundance-based collaborative way that is also in service of the whole, that's not just self-serving, not just serving the project that you're involved with, but is somehow connected to the greater good. One challenge there is languages. So maybe you know the XKCD comic, some of you might know. Does anybody know this kind of comic series? Does it look familiar? No, okay. It's mostly for physics and math geeks, so maybe that's why I love it. But anyways, I think the picture comes across. So in physics and at CERN, and so this is one of the aspects that is very important. It's not so easy to say, well, collaboration works great at CERN, at least most people agree on that. And let's just port that to other areas of science, of academia, and of society. But there's something in physics that is both challenging, of course, but also easy. It uses this language called mathematics, and it's rather easy to get consensus there because there's not so much ambiguity of terms and meanings. So this facilitates consensus, and it facilitates arriving at more and more precise results and even to be able to quantify, to measure them. Is there something like equivalent languages? This is an open question. It might have something to do with emotions, actually, but it's something that needs to be taken into consideration. Shared resources. Here's a beautiful quote from a book that I would like to recommend to you if you want to know a bit more about collaboration at CERN. So one of the people in one of the large collaborations said this, always working at the limit of available skills and resources, there is no slack in the system. To solve the unforeseen problems that crop up on a daily basis and still to make progress, we need to ask non-team members to chip in, integrating them into our teams and sharing with them what we have. So there's a spirit and a culture of sharing, both by necessity, but also there's a certain kind of joy in that, a joy of sharing. But definitely also a need to share because of the complex challenge that is trying to be addressed. Climate change, of course, is also a complex challenge to be addressed, and many other societal and other challenges. So, robust research. There are very intense quality standards for publications and for the discovery of a particle, or such as the Higgs boson, for instance. But anyway, the aspect here that I want to highlight is that within CERN, within these collaborations, they're very intricate, very robust. Actually, at some points frustrating when you're subjected to them, but it pays off. Internal peer review processes. There's a lot of going back and forth, refinement, even on the wording, up to the standards that go into something like this plot here that you see here, this visualization, what kinds of fonts you use, etc. Another key factor is slow science. So this looks like, okay, let's just lean back and do things very slowly and procrastinate. This is not what I mean here. But there is something about the frenzy of trying to make things faster, also because of the competitiveness of the field, that sometimes doesn't allow us to ask really deep questions and ask them deeply, and to take some time to sit with what we have, even sitting with the open questions, and let ourselves be informed by that in any kind of question, to live with the question. It seems like this is a luxury that we cannot easily afford. And I would propose that is something very, very necessary, not just in science, in humanities, in academia overall, but in all of life, to learn how to do things a bit more slowly. This could be by necessity. For instance, in the case of CERN, you have to do things very, very slowly and diligently in order to achieve these high standards of scientific rigor, or by deliberation, and this by intention. And so this is something that connects to the field of contemplative practices. In the example of the Atlas collaboration, you've got about, as was on the previous slide, about 3,000 collaborators all publishing together. So this would make, with about 100 journal publications per year, looks like a very, very low output rate. But it's actually still a very high, kind of rigor and pressure within the collaboration. So people are not twiddling thumbs, but are working very, very hard. And then collaborative co-authorship. So there are these many, even thousands of collaborators in one experiment. The Atlas experiment is the one that I was part of. There is another called CMS, and then there are some others that are increasingly smaller. But still, there's something about all of these people are publishing together. There's no first author. It's not about the fame that one person gets. And there's a nice quote by a US president. It's amazing what you can accomplish if you do not care who gets the credit. And the anthill picture also says it all. There's no ant that says, I'm on top and this is all my work. But together they accomplish amazing things. Same with us humans. It makes things easier when the ego doesn't play such a big role. Flagship projects could be something that can be helpful. I say this with a little bit of caution. This is an image of the Atlas, like a computer-generated image of the Atlas detector, so a huge measurement device. You see the size of humans there as well. A hugely complex machine. It's about half the size of the Cathedral of Notre Dame. But size is it's not all about size or making things larger. This could be a deep question or some other kind of project in other fields. The question of climate change certainly is something like a flagship question, and the flagship is our planet. But there's some aspect of being devoted to some project that has a larger scale that can act as a social glue, and that's actually the point that I want to emphasize in this. Transitions and recontextualizations. I wrote a huge list here, and what how do we find our way through this maze? Epistemic and intellectual humility, I think, plays a very, very huge role. This is what even collaborations at CERN sometimes suffer from. Maybe a lack of humility of individuals. This can always be a problematic factor. Some other huge collaborative projects have had issues with that as well anyway. And it's difficult. It has something to do with not clinging to views, not clinging to what I think is my idea, and I need to prove that, and I need to convince everyone that my idea is the best one. Excuse me. Whoops. There we are. Yes. Yeah. I notice I myself get lost in this slide. I hope you can pick up some words and just be inspired by them. Basically, the thrive of it is to take a more inclusive view on things, to shift to more collaborative ways of looking at things and practices. And there's one aspect, maybe the last one, the time things take. Some things cannot happen overnight. This is maybe something to really meditate on or contemplate for a while. Values and intentions. So this part, for me, values always seem to be something very abstract. I basically fell asleep when somebody was talking about values. And it took a while for me to begin to appreciate it, mostly through my engagement in an intentional values-based community called Leap Forward, in which basically the whole fabric of the community is around certain key values. And that acts as a guiding compass. And I come to believe that that is a very important aspect for any kind of collaborative undertaking. CERN also has a set of key values, as have all kinds of communities and companies and enterprises and organizations. So the question then is, which are skillful values, which shared values would help us in this regard? And how can we support each other to live and work in accordance with them? How can we help each other live up to the promise? Can we consistently show up for ourselves and each other? So it starts by asking the question, what is our common grounds? What are our shared visions, our shared questions? What might be our shared values? It's not really a top-down, neither a fully bottom-up thing. It's something that meets in the middle. Here's a set of values that I would propose, and maybe that can be refined. And I highlighted a couple of them. One of them is relatively straightforward for science and academia. That's integrity. It sounds like it's very straightforward, but oftentimes it's not. It's not actually easy to always be in integrity. And then the question is, what does that mean? A capacity to listen to each other, a capacity and a willingness to care, to engage caringly for each other, not just for the work itself, but for the whole human being. Generosity of sharing ideas, generosity of sharing my resources with each other, and trust that is also connected to that, and humility, and then several others. And important is that these cannot just be abstract things, but needs to be embodied and enacted through practice, individually and in community. Then what are these practices is then, of course, the next question. What do these values mean in practice in our moment-to-moment shared experience? So they're not just abstract terms. And one suggestion that I have, and that's already like a preview of the practices part, is there's a beautiful method called systemic consensing. It's basically a group decision-making, but also group decision-making method, but also one that stimulates creativity. And maybe that might be a practice that can help find out what are our shared values and how do we want to define them, and make them tangible and sort of actionable. Practices and processes. Which are practices and processes that can enable and support successful scientific collaboration? By the way, what I highlight, because before I was showing some things about CERN, and now I'm basically already in this uncharted territory. So some of these things are corresponding to experiences and practices at CERN, and some of them are not. So for the simplicity, I would say that this is all the proposal. This is all the vision that I want to share and invite us to explore together. So what are skillful best practices on all levels, individual, collective, and organizational or systemic levels? And how can they inform and enhance our collaboration? So for individual, I will just, for simplicity, show this so-called tree of contemplative practices. Individual practices, there could be a bunch of them, but what I want to highlight is everything that falls into this domain of contemplative practices. And to make this, actually this is a beautiful quote by Khalil Gibran, "Work is love made visible." So you find some of them that I've already alluded to: meditation, silence, ceremonies and rituals. One question is, of course, well, how does that live with science? It looks like science doesn't have much of a place for that, which is not entirely true because there are ceremonies and rituals in science as well. So this is certainly something to explore more. It could go to things like movement-based practices for the individual. What I'm trying to say here is that there are practices for the individual to both as an act of self-care, but also as a way of knowing oneself more, so that when you are in any situation that might be, let's say, a little bit less easy with your colleagues, with other people, you have resources that will help you switch to a more collaborative way of being with each other, of interacting, be that pausing, listening, just some form of appreciation of each other. And that is, as maybe general as it sounds, part and parcel of any kind of collaboration, is how are we with each other. If I cannot be with myself, I cannot be with you. If I cannot be with you, I cannot be with a team. And if I cannot be with a team, then I cannot serve the larger whole. Relational practices, so moving from the individual to groups of people. So there are some suggestions. One of them I just mentioned before, the consensual decision-making method called systemic consensing, interestingly invented by a theoretical physicist from Graz. Many of the experts in this and trainers are actually in Graz, so this might be a nice opportunity to see how that method can actually help inform and benefit, in this case, academic research and also groups. Communication practices for smaller and larger groups, including conferences. There's one set of practices called Art of Hosting, which is gaining some traction, not yet in science as far as I'm aware of, but in other areas, especially in the corporate world, at European Forum Alpbach, etc. The tagline, I think, is to hosting conversations that matter. There are some skillful practices that elicit group creativity, engagement, participation, etc. And all of these are basically what's needed in order to bring collaboration about in a way that everybody has a buy-in, everybody has a stake in it, and feels motivated, or at least as motivated as you can be. Not as a must, but as a possibility. So, going to the organizational level, I chose the title Compassionate Leadership. You could maybe find other titles for it. And this picture here is actually to maybe provoke a little bit of cognitive dissonance. I don't know whether you can see it very well. It's taken from the UN Security Council. I know very little about the UN Security Council. I see mostly men in suits, only a couple of women who interestingly wear colorful suits, at least some of them that I can spot. I would prefer this picture anyway, really sitting on the ground. And again, if we're talking about questions that are connected in some way to the entire ecosystem, if it is a direct conversation about it or anything else that we want to connect to it, why not have gatherings that are more connected to nature and literally sit on the ground outside rather than in rooms at tables and chairs? And this does not make a scientific or academic conversation or debate any less meaningful. Maybe it adds something, although perhaps oftentimes unexpectedly. And that has been my experience with such practices. Compassionate leadership, there's something called servant leadership, for instance, consensus-driven decision-making methods, something about organizational structures. Some aspects are sociocracy, maybe you might have heard of, or council or circle practices. There's something about sitting in a circle rather than, actually this is a really bad example right now, right? I'm standing here in front, you're sitting behind chairs. I even said that to make it participatory, and everything here is about not making it participatory. Right? So, okay, so this is, so a moment of humility. I frankly noticed that I find it difficult to really be in direct communication with you. So maybe I'll slow down a little bit. And where are we with time?
Time? I would say we do another 10 minutes.
Okay, so I will have to. I won't speed up. Yeah, but see what is most meaningful. And even so, as I need a little bit of time to ground myself. Is there anything for you that has come up thus far that burns inside of you that you want to share, or maybe provoke, or ask a question to each other? It could be an uncomfortable question too, if you want. Maybe. Later, okay. Yeah? Is that the group consensus? Does anybody have objections to asking questions later? So you can indicate by raising one or two hands. Two hands would be a strong objection. That would be systemic consensing in a very quick form. Also part of, I think, sociocracy and other methods. So we all agree on asking questions later, and asking that question actually helps getting people engaged and involved, rather than just assuming. And why systemic? So okay, let me highlight this, because I think it's both an easy thing to implement that I believe can make a huge difference as a stepping stone towards other things, or maybe practices that seem to be a little bit more like, we don't really know how this is going to serve. But what's so special about systemic consensing? I'm feeling energized now. Okay, gotta stay here. But usually, how we doing decision making? By what kind of? There's some kind of voting that we usually use, right? It's called. Does anybody know the name? It has to do with majority, right? Majority vote. Yeah. So oftentimes we make decisions by a majority vote. We have it in politics. We have it like, okay, shall we go here or there? Okay, 3 people say let's go there. One person says no, and oftentimes the group goes in that direction. What does that lead to? That one person will be very, or might be unhappy, maybe frustrated. Imagine that takes place in larger teams. I mean, have you had such experiences maybe in your environments, right? Maybe activity, show your hands if you have experienced that. If you raise your hands if you didn't understand the question, just checking. Or I don't know, my mom's sitting there and doesn't raise her hand either way, so I wonder what's up. Okay, maybe we can talk in the Q&A. So, problem with that method is that it overrides the minority. And I mean, we have to look no further than politics and even recent things that have happened in Austria. It looks like this is just getting messier and messier. Okay, so, and one beautiful way of these consensus-based methods like systemic consensing, even there are other voting schemes that are not this simple majority-based one. And one beautiful thing there is that it basically asks for the group's resistance and tries to collectively arrive at ways, at ideas, at proposals that have the minimal group resistance. In the worst case, what can happen is somebody remains still, not being really happy with the outcome, but I felt heard, I can go with this. And everybody's been part of it. And so you might never find the exact what's perfect for everybody, but you can find something that gets very near. And it's one of the methods that can help arrive at that. It can basically be applied everywhere. So even with yourself. So I've even once tried it with myself and could quickly solve a question that I was grappling with of what to do next. So, okay, I think by now there are probably 5 minutes left, pathways of wholeness. I think what I'm trying to say there, admittedly in poetic language, or at least to some extent poetic language, is that both science and the contemplative practices, contemplative traditions, I see them as pathways of wholeness, something that wants to do, basically, that wants to do good, that wants to investigate the nature of life, the nature of experience, in order to basically in order to be whole. There's nothing less, although the specific questions might be more nuanced. And what I want to propose, well, okay, so here's one that's actually quite funny. This will cost another minute at least. But it's from this XKCD comic. Fields arranged by purity. Now, of course, I want to say this is a fallacy. It's not like that. But it just says from sociology to psychology, biology, chemists, and physics all say your field is just an application of my field. The physicists are proud to be on top. It's nice because I'm a physicist. So mathematicians say, oh, hi, I didn't see you guys all the way over there. So, okay, that's already funny. It gets more funny. But first of all, I want to say, no, that's not a good picture. And it's more of a circular network kind of thing. Here's a beautiful quote by Evan Thompson in the context of meditation research at a conference in 2016. And he said, every scientific study should have an anthropologist, an excuse me, you can read it, ethnographer, oh, that's it, of science, and a cultural historian as part of the team, and maybe more, yeah. And I'm, one response by somebody was afterwards when I talked with him, yeah, we have to do this, but how can we even do this when it's already so difficult? If that becomes part of a larger collaborative undertaking, it can become possible and it can benefit every kind of study, no matter whether it's leaning strongly to the natural sciences or not. And then there is this nice twist here, adding philosophers on both ends of the spectrum, making it for a nice recursive twist. So the sociologists now say philosophy is just applied sociology, and all the way down, the philosopher looks at the whole thing and says, wow. So, and the loop continues and continues. And if the loop continues, then everybody's just deluding themselves about the nature of the whole thing. It is actually recursive. It is actually a network. That's what I want to say there. Yeah. Okay. I've used a lot these two words, contemplation and science, and both in the service of collaboration. And is it a tale of two worlds? So now I could go back to this experience of 14 years ago. And I will make it short and just say, unexpectedly, something happened that when I opened my eyes again, it looked like I was looking at the world for the first time. And I would like to say I was beginning to see with the heart. And that would sound very nice, but I refuse to take any credit for that because I then learned how to ignore and forget that over and over again. What I do know since then is that there is something to be found in this realm of contemplative practices, or even in the realm, if I dare use the word spiritual traditions and practices or wisdom traditions, that is of utmost relevance to our world and to each of us. And certainly for me, I know this from my experience, including the difficulty of bridging these worlds. So question mark, are these two worlds? For a long time, these lived as two distinct worlds for me. I was doing a bit of meditation here. I was doing a bit of science there. I didn't really talk with people from one field or from one area to the other, or especially didn't dare to talk with scientists, including my time at CERN, about even that I have a meditation practice. I thought they would say, well, that's odd. He must be strange. So the problem was not that it's strange, the problem was that I had these self-doubts and didn't know how to talk about that. So, well, maybe a bit more diligent meditation might have helped, but maybe also some other practices. But in any case, what I want to say is, so if we just put them side by side, and, please feel free to argue with me about this, but both are about investigations of phenomena. One is directly phenomenological, direct human experience, understanding oneself from the inside out, as it were, and experience from the inside out. The other, especially natural sciences, natural laws, third-person view, an objective way of looking at the world. And it looks like the one is subjective, the other is objective, the one more intuitive, the other more rational. Both are using instruments of investigation, but it looks like there is not really a fit. Also, what I wanted to put here, a little bit provokingly, is that some concern in these wisdom traditions are about ethics. It's always about being in community, being with each other, and a connection with nature that's always somehow baked into it, because that's where it originally springs from. And surprise, surprise, I would say that's the same for science. And maybe they're more compatible than it seems. But how to make them compatible looks like a very abstract thing. There's actually this field that's been growing over the last couple of years called contemplative science or contemplative research, sciences and humanities, mostly about the scientific investigation of contemplative practices. some examples here at the bottom about some of these projects, about effects on all kinds of ways of long-term intensive meditation training on personal well-being, health, longevity, emotional resilience that can be very important in collaborations in a very tangible way, etc. The resource project in Leipzig in Germany, altruism, compassion, and pro-social behavior, also large studies with fantastic results that investigate what effects could a compassion training, a training in this capacity to relate from the heart to another in a well-wishing way, basically, can actually have all kinds of beneficial effects, including effects of how people, engage and interact with each other. Pro-social behavior seems like something is very much important for collaborative practices, collaborative behavior. So there's some kind of overlap there, some kind of relevance. Bunch of questions here that I will maybe skip the answer to all of these questions. Even the non-yes, no questions for me is yes, and somebody wants to come in. So I don't know, maybe that's the unexpected guest that we need. This would be something that you have in the council practice, that you sometimes leave a cushion and say this is for the unexpected visitor. Or everything that's not there. It's an important question. Who's not in the room? Who is not represented? Are we all like just belly gazing here and I'm telling you nice stories and it's all completely without relevance for the rest of the world? Or, and that's a difficult thing, remind ourselves that there are large parts of humanity and of the world that are not present in this room, but they are also affected. Okay, how might this inform our underlying narratives? I'm a bit provocative and say we're living by myths of scarcity, separation, compartmentalization, etc. Basically, it's stories, and the question is, by what stories do we choose to live? I could give examples, but maybe we can collaboratively explore in the Q&A. And how can we contribute to this gradual transformation towards a mindful academic culture, or the way that I describe it in the title of the Contemplative Scientific Collaboration project, contemplative scientific culture. And when I say scientific, I think Richard always cringes, but I really usually mean sciences and humanities together. And, yeah, okay. Now, experience and expertise, the idea is basically bringing all of these fields of expertise together, maybe with practices like art of hosting, practicing skillful sharing and listening, the best practices of collaboration, insights from all kinds of academic disciplines, including the field of contemplative research that I mentioned, experiences from not only scientists but also contemplative practitioners. I keep on mentioning this. I believe that it's hugely important. I will skip my efforts to try to explain or justify that. It's just, I think it's very important. Okay, and you can challenge me on that. And community building, intentional communities might have a lot of wisdom that can help there, even if they're outside of academia for the most part. But some academic communities are also intentional communities. So maybe there are overlaps and ways to talk about. So individual and group practices, one important thing that's also emphasized in art of hosting is find and nurture your own practice, also how to support each other to have a practice. Could be any kind of practice. Not everybody has to meditate. Maybe some people do journaling, others do yoga, others walk through the woods. But these are supportive, nurturing practices for the individual. And if you nurture yourself, it's easier for you to be with others. Communicate, communication. And academic conferences. And so picking up one thing that Richard is very passionate about, if I bring in the environment, then there has to be something's got to give. So semi-virtual conferences is something that Richard has explored and proposed to reduce the environmental footprint, shared transportation, carpooling. Oftentimes my heart bleeds when I am happily engaging in a buffet where it looks like half of it is being thrown away afterwards. And I think from your group that you take some efforts to, if I'm not mistaken, right? Yeah. To not let that happen. And again, okay, I'll just say it, I think this is hugely important even for something like technical aspects of collaboration, because if we cannot be in integrity and sincere in that regard, why even bother doing any kind of other research? It's like, These things are connected, these things have to go together. Participatory practices for conferences, participatory formats. Sometimes it's still very non-interactive. Again, I'm a little bit non-interactive. It's not the best example. I'm trying unsuccessfully. And I hope the Q&A will help. And also even conversation formats that are not outcome-oriented, just to hear what else is important, what else is in the room, what else matters that is not yet on the table, and sometimes surprising new insights come out for the more technical aspects of collaboration. Organizational culture, systemic consenting, maybe principles from sociocracy, to not just be in this strictly hierarchical systems, more flat hierarchies. There's a beautiful Rumi poem about listening with 1,000 ears, just mention it in passing, to create spaces and times for all these individual and group practices, and to make studies on the effects of that. One aspect that I haven't really gone much into, that is amongst all of that, we all got our blind spots. I think I've been a very good example of blind spots in parts of this. Biases, defense mechanisms, habitual reactive patterns, and it's very difficult to uncover and undo them on your own. This is also why you need community, why you need each other. Bring in some kind of psychological expertise and work there as well. For some reason I brought back this picture. I cannot recall. I don't know exactly where I am. There might be a few more slides left. Where do we go next? Vision and mission of the project. I'll just fantastically skip over that. Some ideas we can talk about. I want to say one thing at least. Let's collaborate, basically. Also for this exploration that I'm sharing with you, find collaborators, find an entrepreneurial partner. It's one of my needs, so I'm inviting you to, become collaborators. It's always a question of attracting funding, and this also works much better if people are working together. And the next step is, I think, basically just listening and the Q&A, but I have some more slides, and I need to go to this one at least before I get to the listening. The thank yous, Richard and Annemarie, Niels for the technical, and Hannes for the technical support. Scott Virden Anderson from the Yoga Science Foundation, who is supporting me and my work. Talia Arnov and others from the Leap Forward community that have inspired me a lot in the community building aspects and values, etc. They have been instrumental in the preparation for me. And and on and on and on it goes, and you. No, really, seriously. And I look forward to the conversation that we'll have now. I will end with one quote, and that is about humility. And it's always a good reminder. So here's the quote by Morris Langlow West. No man, prince, peasant, pope has all the light. Who says else is a mountebank, a charlatan. I claim no private lien on truth, only a liberty to seek it, prove it in debate, and to be wrong 1,000 times to reach a single rightness. And that, to me, is a quote about humility and about listening. And so, with that, I think that's the last slide. Oh, here's the last slide. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks. Very interesting. I have 17 questions. I'm going to let other people to ask their questions first because this is what you said I should do.
Yeah.
No,
Well,
so this. Yeah. Yeah.
in some of these projects that I mentioned. I mean, there are many research projects, especially in the field of contemplative science. I think that's the place to look at. And one of them is this shamatha project, as well as others. And so, yeah, so people are not only studying, although it's still difficult for people to not just study it as a subject, but also engage in the practice at the same time. It oftentimes is everybody has their individual practice. But as far as I understand, in the shamatha project as well as in some other projects, there is an appreciation of actually bringing that together. So basically, yes, the short answer is yes, in the field of contemplative science, you have contemplative science applied to itself. But it's still gaining traction. It's oftentimes still mostly a scientific exploration of contemplative practices, but with a lot of potential to grow. Yeah. Further questions? Yeah. Oh, that's great.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much. Now I forgot my question.
Great.
I think it's a very good endeavor to talk about this and kind of represent these ideas. I think it's a bit difficult because it's, in one way, it's a nemesis for the competitive mainstream system, and it will be a bit difficult. I had this short vision of every university having, like now, every university, at least in Central Europe, has a Center for Gender Studies or how do you call it, Gleichbehandlung?
Yeah.
Equal treatment or something.
Yes.
And it's everywhere. It has to be everywhere now, as it was a process of some decades to establish gender and equity and diversity sensitivity, and now every university has a center for that. Maybe one can think in that in order to plan how to establish thoughts like that, like pro-social centers or something in universities. Just a suggestion.
Yes.
But thanks for this.
It's a great suggestion, and also an appreciation that just adding such a center or gender studies or equal opportunity, I think it's called, doesn't necessarily translate to a practice of all the individuals there. Sometimes it could even provoke adverse reactions. So yes, it's a great challenge. But there's something of that impulse of trying to make things better, and crucially, imposing it top down might not work. It has to somehow meet in the middle, top down and bottom up. It has to somehow come from the individuals together. So if everybody in an organization wants, for instance, to adhere to equal opportunity standards or certain gender standards, then it's fine. But if there is some kind of resistance, I think it goes back to this example with systemic consenting and majority vote. If you try to override some people that are, resistant and pissed off, you might even create polarization, and then in one bubble it works and outside it doesn't. So it's a challenge, but it could be a good way to think about that. You have some, like a nucleus that has its mandate in every such organization. Could be a person, a representative, somebody who's skilled, also as a facilitator. I think that's crucial. And then work from there and let it grow slowly. See what kinds of practices can be adopted next. Something like systemic consenting can be adopted very easily, but you need somebody who's trained in the method. And then see how it works, for instance. And so it. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I could very relate to many of the things you said. I also do meditation, and I also do like studies. I study psychology, and I always think I always feel like these are two different worlds, and these are fighting in my head, and I still don't know really how to connect those two. And yeah, how can I try to get those more combined? And it's so difficult. How, I don't know.
Yeah. And you know, I actually still have that that sense, and many people that I'm talking to have that in some way or another. Do you have your own personal practice, and you somehow keep it outside of the work environment, or you know? But that's the problem with that is, or one problem with that is that it divides you into two different kinds of beings. So, yeah, I hear you. It's who else in the room does have some form of meditation practice or another kind of contemplative practice? So many of us, yeah. And who else has some difficulty or has experienced some difficulty of bringing that together with the rest of life, your professional life, your family life, etc.? I think I should. You should always only ask a question that you're willing to answer yourself. So yes.
So in a way, not. I mean, meditation is supposed to change our reactions to outward input, to stuff that we need, isn't it? I mean, it does.
Yes.
If you meditate for a long time and you go deep within, it will change your reactions.
Yes.
To any outer stimulus, no?
Yeah.
So that is definitely going to happen. You don't have to make an effort that way. It's automatically happening. I would even say if it doesn't happen, you don't meditate deep enough, or you should question your meditation practice somehow, I guess.
Yeah.
So that way, I do not feel that the clash so very much. I mean, I don't openly talk to people in my natural surrounding all the time that I meditate a lot. I don't, but I surely, what I experience is, for example, that's, now since a couple of years, since I'm taking it more serious, that I seem to have a soothing effect on people sometimes. Some people are very tense and very driven by God knows what, I mean, there are many people like that. And I seem to have a soothing effect sometimes. Sometimes I giggle a bit too much and take things too lightly, and then it gets a bit, and these very driven people, they sort of misunderstand. They think, how can you take things so lightly?
Yeah.
That is one difficulty, yeah. So
Yeah.
in that way, I would not agree, but I don't try to push it into people around me that you should meditate or you should start some contemplative practice.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, that's very good. Yeah.
May I also say something? So I think in the private context, it's not a problem. There are two different worlds, and you can do that. But as long as you are in the context of university, I agree with you that you have two different worlds. And I think that may have some historical reason, because in natural sciences we have this ideal, I think it's a false ideal, that we have to exclude everything that is subjective. So we have to try to be objective in order to be good scientists. And it's something like a sign of not being a serious scientist. It's considered to be, that you are of a poorer quality when you include your subjective feelings. And I think that's a problem. And when we overcome that, and when we recognize that we as scientists, we are all humans, and we can give the best if we develop all our capacities as humans and let it flow into science, then we would overcome that problem. So I think it's a false ideal that we have to overcome.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
And I'd like to, am I allowed to respond? Because I think this is a beautiful point. And when, oh damn, now asking this question kind of took me out. Or maybe it will come back. Yeah. Oh, damn it. I see I'm attached to the thought that's no longer there. Okay. That's good.
So psychologists know that emotion and cognition are always completely interconnected. And so from a psychological viewpoint, it's obvious that everybody's emotional about the knowledge that they have and about the communication. We know this, right? And there's also the tradition in physics that subjectivity brings brilliant ideas, right? And there's people, physicists know this. So the subjective approach to a theory, how you talk about it, how you communicate, produces creativity in theoretical physics. So it's a very common idea, actually,
Right.
to mix these things up.
Yeah.
And I also wanted to say that everyone who does meditation or teaches meditation will emphasize that meditation is always imperfect, right? There's always stuff popping into your head and you're always moving around and you're always dissatisfied. So the imperfection in the academic world is mirrored by the imperfection in the world of meditation or spirituality.
Right.
So in that case, they're not so far apart, I think.
Great.
Actually,
Yes, I'll play Advocatus Diaboli. Yeah, because actually what you said, Richard, is very true, and I think that also creativity and efficiency is higher when whatever subjectivity and mindfulness come into play. And there are certain voices around in the world that say that this recent mindfulness movements, which are very much backed up by enterprises who actually make a lot of money with that, show, together with this concept of spirituality, which is also very much connected to that, an individualization of what in former times was religion or transcendence. So everybody is responsible for his or her own enlightenment, not even enlightenment, but for his or her own mind. You were talking about burnout. Of course, it's much better to have scientists and academics who do not burn out, but who do a bit of meditation practice are even more efficient and effective in the meta competition.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So going beyond the direct competition, being more collaborative and mindful and whatever makes even more efficient. Thanks.
You mean in a competitive sense, or possibly in a competitive sense, or okay, do you mean that there's although a little bit of a caveat.
This is about money, right? This is about the taxpayers funding academic research, and they want to get as much as possible out of it as possible. I mean, the university wants to get value for money.
Yeah. So I think that it's not sufficient just to meditate or to have those practices, but also to really change your attitude or your ethical attitude. And so not to misuse those practices in order to be competitive in the old sense, in the ego-centered sense. So I totally agree that it's a subjective change of your own values, and that when that goes together with certain strategies or certain practices, that's fine, but it's not sufficient. That's my point.
Just to add a direct question, I was reading on one of your slides with many suggestions, and then it said beginning with ourselves first.
Yeah.
I didn't really understand what you meant with this phrase. This triggered my skepticism, actually.
In which way does it, before I say something, in which way does it trigger your skepticism?
Because of exactly what I said before, that like this self-optimization via mindfulness, starting with myself first, kind of can take you to this meta competition issue.
Yeah, that was here.
This
okay.
one.
Yes, and to wrap both of your questions together in my responses. on one hand, yes, there are problems that are also recognized within the field, and there is a critique from within the field too, what's sometimes labeled the Mac mindfulness movement, the kind of commodification and marketing of mindfulness practices of all kinds of tools like the Muse headset, etc. So there are ways to make money from that. Sometimes there are, so anyways, and so everything can be, I could make it short and say everything can be hijacked by other motives. That's one thing, so that's rather difficult. The other is for the sake of self-improvement. That can go wrong in many different ways. Like I can try to just self-regulate better through meditative and other practices, even nutrition, sports, etc., so that I can perform even better and thereby exacerbate the whole collective, frenzy that drives the car against the wall. That doesn't necessarily. So the question, in the service of what, always becomes important. And and then there are examples even with like benefits of meditation, like examples of the mindful sniper. I think in Japan there were times when mindfulness practices or meditation practices were connected with military for warfare purposes. And then, okay, depending on whom you ask, you could say that's good or bad, but ultimately I would argue, well, I'm a pacifist, I would say war is not the answer. It breeds more problems. So you always have to ask a question in the service of what, how do you apply it, and what do you really want to do? And the point would not be to be, resiliency is great, but resiliency is so that I can drive myself faster, longer, better. If I had just meditated more, so that I would have endured the self-exploitative cycle that I voluntarily subjected myself to, I would also have gained nothing. Maybe, who knows, I might be dead by now. I'm glad that I'm right here, right now. So it has served something. I wouldn't change that, although an unpleasant experience as it was. So at the time it was scary, of course. I also remember from your question, Annemarie, actually it slipped again my mind. It will come back. It will come back a third time. Whenever I want to address it, I block myself. Okay.
I think Bernd was talking about, has got a name, it's called, well, maybe it's the same. There's a book called Spiritual Materialism by this fellow called Chogyam, something by a Tibetan Buddhist guy who went to America to teach Tibetan Buddhism. Spiritual materialism, which is like selling new age stuff to make money and become rich. Yes.
Right.
Or also just materializing the benefits, right? Always having a goal and achieving benefits, which is problematic.
Yeah.
Usually.
I think the goal should, what is a good purpose? Of course, and we can explore that together. We'll just spontaneously throw out. And it's fuzzy, I admit. To be a decent human being. Can I be a decent human being? Can I be responsible with the ability to respond, not in a reactive way, just kind of driven by automatic behaviors, like you push a button and I start to hit you with a stick? Or can I take things into context? Can I respond in a more creative way? In a way that serves, and then taking all these levels into account. So what's the highest good for me, for us, for this city, this continent, this planet, all species? It's a tall order, but to lean more towards such an understanding in every step we make, it will at some point become more second nature and things will become easier. And currently it's more of this is difficult because here I have these self-serving egoic needs and I am entitled to them. I'm entitled to, fly and be at the banquet at some conference, and why should I stop flying, to pick up Richard's thing, and start to become defensive about it. So, and to say, okay, that's an either or the others should do it, and I'll do it later. There's a lot of discomfort in all of this, and we need to be able to, have conversations about it and then change together. Otherwise, things will continue the way they have done. and not for good.
I think we have to stop now, unless you have a very short question, very short.
No, it's just a remark from psychology. When you have much pressure, then your behavior is more automatical, and so freedom requires that you don't have much pressure, and that goes now into the society or even into politics, where you need to create conditions where people have less pressure in order to develop their insights or their inequalities. So I think you cannot say it's just the inner aspect. I think it's both its society and its the own development that should go hand in hand.
Right, yeah. I also remember now what I wanted to respond, and I can make it brief if we have the time.
1 minute.
1 minute. I'm convinced that the fear that meditative practices, for instance, would in any way take away from the scientific rigor that might be required or that is required, I think that's completely unfounded. We have the methods to be scientifically rigorous. We can hold each other accountable to be with integrity with that. Collaborative, we can do it even better. And so it's like that the one doesn't interfere with the other. Just because I'm meditating, it doesn't mean I'm make up some numbers or paint them in such a way that they are more aesthetically pleasing. I mean, but that's the fear somehow that this is not compatible with rigorous science. I would rather believe it is actually helpful for rigorous science if there is a way to bring it together meaningfully and to do that in community. So there's the contemplative aspect, the community aspect, the rigorous science aspect, bring all of that together, and that might take decades or I don't know how long, so it's worth trying.
So thank you, that's a great place to stop, and I think we got some good ideas, and we're going to go and somehow the ideas will go around our head and come out next week or next year in something, you know what I mean? And so this is the end of our wonderful live stream, and I think we can turn it off now. Thank you very much.